Oh, another bright Sunday morning. And I would like to welcome you all for this webinar. And Outside In is an ecology series that is designed to prime high school students and young adults into this sort of subject. And we've had a number of very nice talks so far. And today I'm happy to welcome Dr. Meghna Krishnadas, who is an ecologist. And she is currently a scientist in the lab for Conservation of Endangered Species in CCMB Hyderabad. And she had done her PhD in the Yale University. It was on forest communities, connecting trees, seedlings, insects, and fungi. I think that's a fabulous topic, very broad one, but I was amazed to see her career trajectory is also pretty broad. She's been interested in monkeys, and therefore the fruits that they eat, and therefore the trees that bear the fruits, and her interest had been on trees. But wait a minute, there is something more to it, because she had been a medical doctor to begin with in her earlier years. That I think is a fantastic career trajectory. It's very nice to have Meghna here today to share some of her research interests. And her lab interests are on the human influence on Earth, to put it simply. That means, the ecological community, the biodiversity, and the productive capacity of the Earth. With this, I would like to request Meghna to start her talk. Meghna, please.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Saudamini, for that very nice introduction. And thank you to NCBS and BLISC for inviting me to present this to you. Thank you to all of you for making the time on a Sunday morning and joining me here for a talk, which I really hope you will enjoy, about a subject that is really close to my heart, which is to understand the lives of trees, basically, like I said. And, one of the key reasons why we kind of study these things as scientists is because today, the world is shaped largely by humans, and the human footprint sort of has an impact on 80% of the biosphere. And we use up such a huge amount of the Earth's productive capacity. So how this affects other species is really a key question of our times. So that is kind of where my research is geared towards. But in order to understand how our biodiversity is responding to some changes, whether human or otherwise, we first need to understand basic concepts of how this biodiversity is shaped and structured and spread across the world anyway. And that is kind of where my research comes from. So, and today I hope to share with you some of of my insights into the lives of trees. Just give me a second while I share my screen. All right, well, I hope all of you can see this. If I'm not hearing from Pavitra, then I'm guessing that it's all fine. So we will start from there. So imagine that you have decided to see a forest. So you go to this place where you know there is a forest and you want to see a large expanse of it. So you climb up a hill, and after toiling your way up the hill, if you are lucky on a clear day, such as we have today, hopefully in Bangalore as well, you might see a site that looks something like this. A beautiful, vast expanse of green. And everything, there might be a few, this is clearly not still in the sense that there might be a few birds moving around. You might see some animals, like maybe a monkey jumping on a tree. But when you look at the trees themselves, for the most part, this looks like still life. It looks like they're just there. They're just standing there. And if you zoom in closer, or maybe even if you come back like a few years later to the same place, you're most likely to see the scene exactly the way it is that you saw it before, and exactly as still as before. So then the question is, what is happening to the lives of trees? Are they really just still and nothing much happens to shape them where they are and how they are? Or is there something more? Is this still life hiding a whole myriad of actions, but it's all happening in slow motion, happening at a pace that we humans don't quite see or understand? And so it needs a different perspective for us to get to understand or look into the secret lives of trees. And that's kind of what I try to do, or I'm fascinated to do in my work. And the answer is that, yes, this is a lot of action happening. Trees do a lot of things. They have to face a lot of hurdles to get where they are and to become the kind of forests or the kind of habitats that we see them as. And this is what forms the basis of ecological science. Like, how are we going to study what species are where they are? Why did they get there? How are they interacting with species, other individuals around them? And it's no different for trees. Now, for example, if you're a tree in a rainforest, a big hurdle for you to face is that the rainforest is really dark. There's barely any sunlight that comes through to the forest floor. So many of the trees in rainforests actually have to be very shade tolerant. And you have to be competitive in being able to use resources and grow and live despite there being the stress of shade. On the other hand, there are some places like, a woody savanna, you might have to be really tolerant to drought or the scarcity of water or heat, because that's the kind of stress that you will face in order to survive in a dry forest or a savanna. Move on to a temperate forest, and then you as a tree will have to be able to face frost and cold and these really, really long winter seasons in order to survive and keep persisting. And to top it all, it's not just enough that the environment is sort of hitting you in so many different ways in all of these places, but as a seedling or a grass or a tree, you get attacked by herbivores that use you as food. You get attacked by insects and pathogens, and they are constantly eating you and putting the stress on you. Either they kill you or they damage you, and so you have to keep up with making up or fighting all of these organisms. And to top it all, you're of course in competition, right? You don't stand alone in a forest. You have these neighbors around you, big trees, small trees, other seedlings, and you have to face competition from all of these individuals and make sure that you survive all of this in order to get to being where you are. And this, like I said, forms the basis of most ecological studies about forests. Why are these species where they are? Why do forests look the way they do in different areas? And which species do better? Which species don't do as well? And what are these factors that drive where species do the best? Now, the first and foremost thing, when you look at trees, like I said, they look like still life, and they are. An individual tree doesn't really move, right? Throughout its life, it kind of stays in one place. And the only time that a tree does move is when it is a seed. And this is a process that we call dispersal. Seed dispersal is a fascinating subject, and much has been done about it. And there's probably too much done for me to cover, obviously. But the first step in a plant's life is to interact with these animals or the wind and water such that moves its seeds. And then some of these seeds will, or rather not all of these seeds will survive. The seeds also face a lot of stiff stress. They get eaten by rodents, or they get infected or by insects, or they get infected by fungi. But, once it sort of gets through all of these bottlenecks and manages to put its roots down as a seedling, that's where the real, the story of the tree starts, the life of a tree starts. And this is a stage that I study quite extensively, because the seedlings are a stage that's actually quite dynamic, probably the most dynamic. You come back to a plot of like a small 1 meter by 1 meter square meter of land, and you're not going to see the same number of seedlings or the same kind of seedlings. Even if you come back in like 6 months or 1 year, things change very rapidly, because there's a lot of action already happening in that young life stage that is going to, shape the future of the forest as it is. So what is happening with these seedlings? Well, first of all, when you look at the picture on your left, you see that, I hope my left is also your left right now, but you see that seedlings can get really crowded. They fall in an area, or they settle down, set roots in an area where there are lots of other seedlings that they have to compete with. And they also have to compete asymmetrically in some sense with these larger trees that are there around them, and which draw resources away and shape the lives of seedlings in ways that we are going to see now. Now, the first thing that happens with seedlings, of course, is that not everything gets everywhere because of the whole dispersal thing. But let's just say that some species, they manage to get to all these sites that we see in a forest. So in this cartoon, what we have is 3 sites, and imagine that these are 3 different sites in a forest. Now, by some stroke of luck, these 3 different species, the black one, the 4 different species, the black, the orange, the red, and the brown one, have all managed to establish 2 seedlings each in this area. Great. So what happens next? Not everybody is going to survive everywhere, because these sites differ in their conditions, what we call the environmental conditions, and the environment can sort of filter species. Why? So site 1, for example, might be a site that is quite wet. It has a lot of it gets a lot of rain, or it gets a lot of water, maybe it's next to a stream. But as we go towards site 2, it kind of gets drier. Site 3 seems to be really dry for some reason. And we are going to see that these differences in the environmental conditions pose different kinds of stresses for different species. So when we take the next step, let's say we go back there after like 6 months, what we see is that in site 1, maybe because it's pleasant, everything is wet, they're getting, it's easy to live there, all the species and their seedlings seem to be alive. But at site 2, we see that some of the species or some individuals of some of the species have actually disappeared. And so the black species and the brown species are now kind of dominating the seedling community. Whereas, let me see, okay. Now, when we go to site 3, which is the driest of them, we see that some of the species that we started off with just don't survive, and we are only left with 2 species. And this phenomenon is called environmental filtering, which means that even if a species gets to a place, it has to face the stresses imposed by the environmental conditions, and the environment can filter these species to finally determine what this community of seedlings is eventually going to look in these different places. Now, once we have this filtering taking place, it doesn't stop there. Like I showed you in the previous picture, seedlings can often be in, they're interacting very closely with each other, because you can find up to like 10, 100 seedlings in a 1 by 1 meter area of patch of forest. And so they're all using resources from that area. They're competing with one another in that area. And so what happens is during this competition, maybe some of these individuals have certain features that allow them to do better than others. Maybe, some individuals do really well when the water is, when there's plenty of water, or maybe there's a phosphorus that is limiting in these areas, and those that can survive in low phosphorus conditions are the ones that will become more and more dominant there. So when we come back after 6 more months, we are going to see a slightly different picture again from the initial cohort of seedlings that we started. And so on and so forth. When this process of filtering takes place for some time, this is what gives rise to a change in the communities of seedlings, the ones that survive and are successful in different sites. And this is what we call species turnover. And in some sense, this is what leads to diversity, because you're not going to find that the same species does well everywhere. There is no chance, or very little chance, that one species will occupy all of the sites. Depending on who you are and what your characteristics or features are you able to tolerate the cold? Are you able to tolerate drought? Do you do well with less phosphorus? Do you need more nitrogen? The kind of species will change from site to site, and this leads to what increased diversity through space and time. But like I said, the life of seedlings is also hard, because there are these little tiny things that are there in the forest, but they have to compete against giant trees. And this is what scientists call asymmetric competition, because trees are definitely more capable of drawing resources or withstanding enemies, or being able to grow to a height, or having grown to a height where they shade out seedlings and things die out. And these interactions of seedlings with the trees, the older trees around them, also plays a big role in how the community, the young forest, is going to look. So imagine this to be a forest. And now we went and, if we look at it, then there are many different species of trees and there are many different species of seedlings. And we kind of go out and set plots and realize that, okay, this seedling is found here and there. Let's talk of 1 year when these two species, the black species and the red species, have produced a lot of their seedlings. Now, what happens usually is that most of the time you see a larger concentration of seedlings of a species beneath its own parent. And think of it, this is because, there are lots of seeds being produced on that tree. Most of the seeds fall down to the same place, and the seedlings that come up are usually more numerous under the parent rather than somewhere far away. Take, for example, the black species, where you see that there are 4 seedlings underneath its parent, but only 1 or 2 of them away from the parent. The same thing with the red species. Now, what a lot of long-term studies have shown is that in general, it seems like individual seedlings don't do as well. And by that, I mean, they don't survive as well or grow as well when they are in a location that's close to a larger tree of their own species, as opposed to being in a place where they're surrounded by some other species. So again, let's start with the black species. Over time, let's say maybe 2 or 3 years down the line, if we come back to this place and we record the mortality, or which seedlings have lived and died, what we'll find is that more seedlings that are closer to the adult would have died out than a seedling that is probably farther away from its adult. And this is most prominent, for example, for the red species, where nearly all of the seedlings that are very close to the adults kind of die out. But if it gets away from the adult, then it survives very well. So this is called a neighborhood effect. The fact, or if there's a very fancy term for it, and it's called density dependence, which means that when you have a higher density of your own species, you are not able to survive as well as you are when you are in a place where the density, where you're surrounded by other species. Now, this is a fascinating phenomenon. And what happens because of this is there is a thinning, which means that after all of this environmental filtering that we spoke about, the seedlings still have to contend with the kind of neighborhood they find themselves in. And that, again, regulates the structure of the forest or the seedling community as we see it. So most of the time, the seedlings that are closer to the parents will die out, and you will have other species that come up in that area around it, and seedlings that go far away from their parent will survive better there. And this phenomenon helps preserve diversity at very small scales, because one species cannot have its seedlings take up all of the space. When a species, a large tree species or an adult tree species becomes more abundant in a place, its seedlings start doing less well than another species, which is rare. So over time, this actually helps maintain diversity. This kind of thinning effect helps maintain what we call a more diverse seedling community, a more diverse tree community in nature. But there are also differences among species. And this is another fascinating field of study, which is that why scientists have noticed that some tree species are actually better able to survive next to their own kind than other tree species. Like in this case, the black tree species in this forest manages to establish, or its seedlings manage to establish close to the parents, as well as in some places that are farther away. The red tree species seems to be more sensitive and has fewer seedlings establishing next to the parent. And so over time, what happens is this key phenomenon drives which species tends to become more abundant or common in a forest or in a habitat, and which species is rare. And understanding some of these factors that will tell us why is a species rare is also important for the conservation of these species. For example, if we know that a species is really sensitive to its own kind, if you're trying to restore that species, you're not going to plant it in groups where you have many of its own kind. You're going to plant it in more diverse mixtures, But if you have a species that can withstand its own kind better, the proximity to its own kind, you can use it to, let's say, start a restoration program where you need things to grow quickly and grow in larger numbers, such that you can then go on to the next stage of restoring that patch of land. So these kind of informations are very key to help us understand why are there differences between some species in terms of whether they are rare or common. Can these aspects of commonness and rarity change? And do we have to pay special attention to some features of what makes species rare? And does that mean that we might have to pay special heed to how we are going to conserve these species in the long run, or how we are going to maintain diversity in a forest in the long run? So the next question, of course, is that, yes, we saw that there is filtering by the environment, and then these seedlings interact with their adults. And then we realize that when seedlings land next to an adult of their own kind, or when they are in cohorts or groups of their own species, they don't do so well. Great. There's a lot of science to tell us that. But the next question, logically, would be why? Why is it that seedlings don't do so well when they are next to those other individuals of their own kind? And the answer lies in pests, parasites, and pathogens, or disease, in other words. Why? Because in a forest floor, you have all kinds of pests, parasites, and pathogens that are constantly attacking seedlings, seeds and seedlings, actually. So you have herbivores that will nibble on seedlings and they will chew them up and kill them. You have insects that will eat seeds, that will chew on, again, feed on little seedlings. And because seedlings are already under stress from not being able to get enough light, not being as big as trees to be able to photosynthesize, sometimes they just can't handle the stress and they die out. And then, of course, there are fungal pathogens and bacterial pathogens that attack seedlings. Now, the dynamics of these kind of attacks by different groups of plant enemies is that usually plant enemies, like any fungi or insects, they tend to attack individual seeds and seedlings when they are in larger groups of their own kind, rather than when they are somewhere far away. And usually this crowding happens next to a parent tree. So often the enemies that attack a plant or attack a seedling are do so more when the seedling has landed next to its parent. And this is a really cool phenomenon, which is what helps maintain diversity of the forest. And I don't know if you have thought of this before, or if you know this already before, but this is something that fascinates me considerably, that the reason why we have plant diversity, the reason why a rainforest is a rainforest, really is because of these invisible forces that are acting through fungi and insects and organisms that we don't always pay attention to, that we don't see very often, but they are regulating which species lives or dies, how many of it lives, where the species is able to survive, and in time regulating how much diversity this forest can face. So again, the next logical question becomes, how does it do that? And the answer lies in something called host specificity, which means that this impact that I spoke about in terms of enemies, plant enemies thinning individual species when you're next to other individuals of your own species, happens if enemies are sort of focused, each enemy or groups of enemies are focused on one particular species. So then think of it like an epidemiological thing. When are you more likely to get a cold? When you're in crowded situations, right? And especially if you're vulnerable to disease. So in this figure, you have many different kinds of fungal pathogens. Let's start with that. I'm quite fascinated by them. And the pathogen for the green species, or the green species of seedling, has its own pathogen. The blue has its own, the black has its own, and so on and so forth. So the black species pathogen usually causes most mortality or can kill the seedling most effectively when it is able to feed on the black species. Similarly for the green species. So which is why that thinning effect takes place. When a species or an individual seedling lands next to an adult of its own kind, that adult has built up a lot of these pathogens in a soil. or maybe it attracts the insects that like to, feed on the tissues of that species. And so when the seedling lands there, it just has more tendency to be attacked by its host specific enemy than if it had landed somewhere else where, if the species is not there, its associated enemy is not that abundant. So this is a phenomenon which really allows different species to coexist, because think of it, when a species, let's say some tree gets really abundant, and which means that it is found very frequently. You walk 10 meters, 15 meters, you're going to see the same tree. But that also means that the soil underneath it for quite some distance is being cultured by this tree, or is suitable for the pathogens of the species. So this abundant species, wherever its seedling lands, it's quite likely to encounter its pathogen and die out. A rare species, on the other hand, can find a spot in the forest where its host specific enemy or pathogen is not there, because its adults are not that frequent or common. And so what happens is this gives an advantage to the rare species, that it never really quite dies out. This common species, which is otherwise doing very well, it cannot push it out of the system. This rare species persists, and the more rare species we have, the more species can coexist with one another because of these thinning and dynamics that are regulated by pathogen, the higher the diversity we have. So this is fascinating, because what this tells us is, in order to maintain the diversity of systems like rainforests, we do need to make sure that we understand some of these processes that are driving the diversity and focus our attention towards maintaining or ensuring the integrity of these processes from operating in nature if we want to save these systems. So all of this that I described that happens with seedlings with respect to them being filtered by the environment, or with respect to them facing competition, or them being regulated by their enemies, applies throughout every life stage. The reason I focused on seedlings is because they are the most vulnerable. They're also the most dynamic. Like I said, it's constantly changing and they're under constant flux, and they face the biggest pressures. But all of these, like long-term science, trees are long-lived organisms. We need science for 30, 40, 50 years to study these organisms to understand what's going on. But it turns out that this whole concept of every individual survival being dependent on where it lands, on the neighbors that surround it, persists through the entire life of trees. And even larger trees tend to not do as well when they are surrounded by their own species than when they are surrounded by other species. So, diversity just seems to beget diversity in some sense. So basically what we see is that adversity, which is that if there is a stress posed by the environment, if there is competition, and if there are enemies, these are the factors, the key ecological factors that sort of help drive and shape where species are found, how common or rare they are, how different ecosystems look, and therefore shape patterns of diversity and species abundance, not just at the small spatial scales that I spoke about within say a rainforest, but also across the globe. When you move across large areas, some will do well in cold areas and some will do well in warm areas, and so on and so forth. Now, if you are like me, then just all of this is fascinating enough, in the sense that it's really cool. I find it really cool to just sit and think through these processes that are structuring the seemingly still life of trees that we see around, and figure out why is it that we have diversity, why do species exist where they are. But these questions are not merely one of intellectual curiosity. The reason or the causes underlying how plant diversity comes to be is also important for us to understand, because that will determine, like I said before, how will these plant communities, whether trees or grasses or whatever, how will these plant communities respond to a changing world? Now, why am I talking about a changing world? Because we know that we live on a planet that is largely shaped by human influence today. So I'm just going to play a short video for you to illustrate what I mean when I say there is a changing world and what human impacts are sort of doing. So I hope that played for all of you, and I apologize if it did not, if any of you were not able to see it, but you can please write to me and I can share these videos if you require. But that video, if you could see, it sort of illustrated what I mean by saying that we live on a changing planet. Forests are being used at alarming rates today. There is the statistics of 25 football fields of forest being destroyed every day or something in the Amazon. And we don't have such a video for, or at least I couldn't find in my search, such a graphic explanatory video for India, but the story is not very different. So in addition to the fact that forests are being lost and habitats are being lost, there is also climate change, or what we generally call global environmental change. We know that the climate or the earth is getting warmer. This is leading to climatic shifts such that some places are getting warmer and drier, other places are getting wetter. In general, the climate in different places is changing. There are more extreme events. So there is also the environmental change that is caused by huge amounts of agriculture runoff that leads to nitrogen deposition and phosphorus deposition. So humans, basically, I cannot say this enough, are changing the planet at massive, massive scales. And fragmentation, or the breaking up of one's contiguous large patches of forest into smaller parcels, and environmental change due to human activities are the top threats to biodiversity today. And what happens is that in order to understand how such threats or the impact of these threats will be on biodiversity, that's where all of that knowledge that I spoke about comes in. So if you want to understand how forests will respond to fragmentation or global environmental change, we need to now apply all of this knowledge to these contexts of changed environments and see which of these processes are being affected and what should we do in order to maintain the integrity of these processes. Now, in a fragmented forest, for example, the first question becomes, if this large patch of forest that was once connected to one another has just gotten chopped up like this, Swiss cheese style, there are holes everywhere. Can animals move between patches? This is where the question of dispersal comes in, for example. And there's been a lot of study that has been done about animals' ability to disperse across patches and whether that determines how diversity is maintained across these fragmented patches. The second thing that happens in fragments is that, again, focusing on trees, but this is actually true for any organism, there's a change in the kind of resources that are available for different organisms. So if you take trees, for example, or plants, how much light is available, how much water is available, that is how much soil moisture is available, what kind of nutrient profile is there in the soil. All of this changes depending within fragments, depending on whether this, where the plant lives is sort of next to the edge of the fragment or close to the edge of the fragment or in the interior. And this is what we call edge effects. And there's a whole body of study that looks at how organisms respond when they are close to the edge of a fragment versus when they are far away, whether some organisms do better when they're at edges and some do better when they're farther away. And therefore there are suddenly these winners and losers being created by another force, which is different from all of the natural forces that have been acting, or well, let me just say non-human forces that have been acting on shaping these communities. So let's come back to enemies, talking about one such change that might be happening. Why enemies? So like I said, people have looked at fragmentation and its effect on plant communities in terms of whether species are dispersing, are they responding to light, to water, and all of that. But one thing that people hadn't really quite looked at is whether the role of natural enemies like fungi, insects, pests, pathogens changes in fragments or closer to edges in these human modified forests compared to what we see in the intact forest or in the interior forest. So by now, you know that I'm obsessed with plant enemies and the way they interact with their plant hosts, etc. So I decided to look at this aspect of plant communities. So what I wanted to see is there is literature, a lot of research, which shows that closer to edges, we lose the diversity of trees, or the number of tree species decreases near edges. There's also some literature which shows that closer to edges, you have a different community of insects, you have a different community of fungi. So I wanted to put these two things together because my argument was that, hey, we know that in intact forests, the community of fungi and insects together shape the community of trees. So when we see a loss of trees, do fungi and insects have a role to play in the loss of tree species or the poorer performance of some tree species, loss of diversity at fragment edges? And I did this study in our backyards, which is in the Western Ghats. I went to this landscape, which once was a large contiguous forest, but then, about 100 years ago, they decided to grow trees. So they chopped up large patches in between. And now it exists as these forest patches embedded within a matrix of tea. And what I did was basically I set up a large number of plots all across the forest. I monitored seeds and seedlings that came in, and then I sprayed fungicides and insecticides and checked what seedlings came up in plots where fungi were absent and where fungi were allowed to operate, and whether this differed between interior forest and the edge of the forest. And interestingly, I found that closer to edges, fungi and insects or plant enemies did not have as strong a role to play in being able to diversify the community like we have seen. And so that might be a key process, that seems to be a key process implicating in this pervasive or continuous loss of diversity, plant diversity that we see near forest edges. And that's all cool, but that was literally just scratching the surface. And I would love to talk more and in more detail about what I did, but I think there's so much more that goes on in this field, which other people are doing, which I think is more fascinating. And the next thing, of course, becomes like, okay, so my research or our research sort of shows that the role of enemies changes, particularly fungal enemies, but we also know that trees form symbiotic or positive relationships, beneficial relationships with organisms like other fungi, like our vascular mycorrhizal fungi or ectomycorrhizal fungi, which you see, by the way, a lot in temperate forests, maybe not so much in tropical forests. And so the next series of questions really for me is whether closer to forest edges or when forests get fragmented and disturbed by humans, is this balance, this complex interplay of interactions between positive and negative organisms, is it changing? And is that really shaping which tree species are doing better? That is, are these interactions shaping winners and losers as we see them? And will they then shape in turn the kind of forest that we see in the future? And the next big question, of course, is, I mentioned climate change. So we know that the microclimate already changes because of fragmentation. Edges tend to be drier and warmer, interiors become more cool and humid. And when there is a changing climate, that is, if the climate itself is becoming warmer and drier, does that mean that forests that have a lot of edge, which are fragmented, are going to have more mortality of seeds, seedlings, trees? And is that going to, again, further shape the community of trees or the forest as we see it in the future? This is a big question that is being asked today that scientists are sort of tasked to answer. How are these different kind of stressors, mostly human-mediated stressors that are playing out in nature, how will they affect the future of these ecological communities and habitats? And we know for drought, for example, is going to be a huge stress because of water scarcity. This is the only graph I have put in here, but just to show you that, even across a large wet forest, we see that species do not survive in all places, or all species don't survive in all places with similar water availability. So a next step is we are setting up experiments to figure out which species do well with water, which species don't do as well. And is that going to determine how well they do in fragmented forests that may be more susceptible to drought conditions? And is drought or climate change sort of going to reorganize or likely to reorganize the composition of forests at a very large scale? I also am really fascinated to ask questions about, what will happen in a changing climate with pests and pathogens. We saw, my research is showing that in fragmented forests with changes in microclimate, you can have differences in interactions. Now, if you add climate change on top of that, what is going to be the consequence for plant diversity, the way it is shaped by pests and pathogens? So, in sum, I sort of took you through this very large and broad overview of some of the key forces that are shaping forests as we know it and plants as we know it. Just to say that, it is not a still life, but there is so much happening that we can't see, but it's so amazing to be able to try and figure that out. And so the next time you walk into a forest, do please notice, a tree is not just standing there. Please notice who is next to it, what other species are next to it, what is the kind of soil that is underneath, what kind of seedlings are present in the soil underneath. What can you see about who's eating the fruits of the tree, and which tree seems to be more abundant, which is or more common, and which is more rare. So basically, all of these interactions sometimes happen in such a small amount of space, but that's the magic of ecology, that a small square meter of space can be a universe in itself. And that's the kind of science that that really fascinates me, and that I think we need to know in order to understand our changing world today. So that's it. Thank you so much, everyone.
Interest peaked in this now, and we want to start addressing some of the many questions we've received, and I'm sure more will come in. So our first question is about kind of our interaction with trees in a different way.
Mm-hmm.
Is it safe to sleep below trees at night in a forest? Because of carbon dioxide.
Sorry, can you repeat the last sentence? It wasn't clear to me.
No, so I said because of the carbon dioxide release at night, is that
Uh-huh.
a factor for us?
Okay. Uh, well, I think that the carbon dioxide that is released by trees is really not going to be as much of a problem as maybe the leeches or the ticks or maybe elephants, depending on which forest you're in. So dioxide you're worried about, then it's okay, you're safe there. But do take care where you are deciding to sleep under the tree that you do, because your neighborhood is going to matter a lot there.
Completely different question about how plants might be able to recognize their own kin. So is there a chemical communication between the seedlings you mentioned if they are so closely spaced and stuff like that?
Mm-hmm. That is a $1 million question, and it's a fascinating field of study. We know, I think during Deepa's talk, she spoke about mycorrhizal association, that is arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi. These are fungi that sort of form these webs. It's called the wood wide web now. So yes, there is this developing theory and a lot of studies that are being done on how individual plants might be communicating with one another using these mycorrhizal associations, because we know that different plants associate with different fungi and species tend to associate with similar fungi. So I don't think we should see it really as, in a very anthropomorphic or like from a human perspective only, that they are in some ways deliberately communicating with one another. This is a product of evolution, in that developing these sort of connections has been beneficial to the survival of these species or these individuals in the long run. So yes, plants do communicate, at least in this way. There is some evidence to show that there might even be communication happening through chemical cues. And there's also communication in the sense that, when there is, in some context, when a plant is attacked by a certain herbivore or pest, it releases these chemicals which allow plants of its species or other plants to sort of up their defenses and protect themselves from this potential threat from enemies. So yes, there are these communications. I wouldn't really think of it in a very human communication kind of way, but yes, there are these channels by which plants do communicate with one another, and it is a fascinating and growing field of study. So we should certainly stay tuned into that space to see what's going to happen.
Okay, thanks. So there's a question about, I mean, I think you spoke a little bit about why seedlings are attacked, but, why specifically do they attack seedlings more than older trees? Is it, what is the main reason or criteria for that?
I would just say vulnerability. Seedlings are two things. So seedlings are not completely woody, right? Trees have, trees when they are grown, they are woody, they have more defenses. And so they are often better protected in many ways. Size is a big factor. Seedlings are tiny, it's like compare a human baby with an adult. Both are vulnerable to diseases, but there are some diseases that babies are more vulnerable or more susceptible to. And if they contract the disease, they are more likely to have a negative effect from that disease than an adult or an older person by comparison. The second thing, of course, is defenses. Seedlings are young, and because of which they haven't really formed all of their defenses to the full extent that is possible. In older trees, those defenses are more developed and often stronger. The third thing is resource scarcity. Like I said, seedlings are under constant stress. So if you go into a rainforest where it is very shaded, seedlings are under a lot of stress because of that shade. They are not able to access light. They can't photosynthesize. So if, let's say, they lose some of their tissue to infection, they are not able to photosynthesize and make up for that lost tissue, or to up their defenses enough to fight that infection, to fight those pests and pathogens as an older tree. So due to all of these reasons, like their small size, their vulnerability without defenses, and their being under stress due to lack of resources, sort of make seedlings in general more susceptible to enemies and cause greater mortality in seedlings. I can't hear you, Pavitra.
Oh, okay. Can you hear now?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So I was asking about invasive species actually, because you've spoken a lot about, the kind of diversity in a rainforest or a regular forest. And what about, when an invasive species comes in, but like, there have been eucalyptus is an example, right? Like when you plant that in one area and it kind of takes over the whole region and it destroys the indigenous forestry. So what about the pathogens? Is it because pathogens for that don't exist in that region? What is the kind of reason for them to thrive?
Yeah, very cool question. And there's a lot of cool science that goes into answering this question. You sort of answered it when you said that do their pathogens don't exist? So this is called the enemy release hypothesis. It is supposed to be one of the reasons why invasive species are able to do so well in a new area. So assuming that, they come in and the environmental conditions are suitable, etc., a factor that can help invasives become invasive is if they don't have their pathogens cutting back their numbers. So all of the other species are experiencing this, thinning, this culling, this stress due to pathogens, and invasives just don't have that. So this is not applicable to all species, but it is definitely an important hypothesis that is being tested to see which invasive species are being benefited by this process and how. And that plays a major role in regulating invasives as well. If it's enemy release, then is there any way to control that, or can we manage ecosystems in that way? But it is pretty complex. But that said, there is also this question of positive associations. It's not just about the enemies, but some invasive species might actually be able to better use, like trees, might be able to better use beneficial fungi and form beneficial associations that might help them thrive in certain habitats that are otherwise stressful, or help them do better than native trees that haven't for some reason formed these associations. So these are very complex relationships, but again, a lot of studies going on to see which of these are applicable for what kinds of species.
Okay. I guess that's again another complicated question, right? So we have a question that's kind of about vertical foresting. In a concrete jungle, is that an option to sort of help with, building greenery up in an area that it wasn't there?
So if I understand the question, as I understand the question, by vertical foresting, you mean like growing trees on rooftops?
Yeah.
Right?
And I think also some buildings have perhaps, put them in on the sides and that kind of thing.
Okay.
those kinds of.
Okay, so on a general level, I'm a fan of anything green. So yes, grow as many trees as you want in cities. I think we desperately need them. That said, I am not a specialist in urban ecology. Uh, there are certainly clear benefits to urban green spaces, to urban greening, whether it is through growing trees on avenues or having common green spaces or near lakes or even roof gardens, whatever it is, all kinds of greening in general can be beneficial and should be part of planning for urban spaces. And yes, a lot of this, when done sensibly, when done with native species, can also help us give us many co-benefits in terms of increasing the diversity of urban spaces, increasing bird diversity, insect diversity, and many different animals that depend and interact with these tree species. So I don't know if I answered the question exactly, but urban greening or how to green urban spaces is definitely something we should be considering very strongly.
Okay. So this is a completely different question again. I'll try
Okay.
to make a variety. So this is about whether, there are, so as you mentioned, for instance, there were in the Amazon, there were people protecting particular patches of land, right? And in India, we have the sacred groves. So is there any specific work being done to help with the preservation of sacred groves or anything like that?
Um, well, yes, there is. It is again a complex and maybe a controversial subject. Um, the allowing people to access some spaces and have some say in how to protect it and being able to take some ownership in assuming that that results in or that can help them protect those spaces either for themselves or for whatever benefits that they may gain from it is certainly a good practice. Sacred groves in India, many large scale assessments have shown that sacred groves may not do as much or as well in protecting biodiversity as say protected areas or things that have a more formalized system of protection. Many areas also sacred groves, sometimes they tend to become smaller, they lose or they disappear. There is also this question of whether these small fragments can replace, like can these many small fragments replace a very large patch of forest, even if you add up the total area. In many cases, the answer is no. Some cases, the answer might be yes. So again, I'm just being a spoil sport scientist here in saying that the answer is not a one size fits all. And this is why we need to understand these processes and these patterns and see where in what context, what seems to work.
Okay. So I'm going to take one person's question who's raised their hand.
Okay.
Srinati, please go ahead with your question.
Are you able to hear me?
Yes, Srinati. Hi.
Thank you, Dr. Meghna, for the wonderful talk. The question that I had was, as you mentioned, nature seems to have a way of controlling populations of different species and maintaining the biodiversity. But we humans have managed to congregate and form dense communities over the last few centuries. So are pathogen attacks like Spanish flu, COVID-19, are these side effects of such dense human populations? And even if we are able to find a vaccine in the next year or so and find a cure to COVID, unless we manage to move away from these dense congregations, will we continue to have such pathogen attacks in the future?
Okay. Thanks, Srinidhi, for that question. There are quite a few layers to that, and I am maybe not the best person to answer all aspects of the question. I'll try my best to see what I can confidently and accurately answer. So, in terms of humans as a species also being culled back, human numbers being culled back by their pathogens. Yes, that has happened, and we know even from historical evidence that the incidence of disease and infectious diseases has generally been higher in human history whenever there have been larger and larger groups of humans coming together and living in crowded spaces like cities, or when agriculture started, etc. That said, like you correctly pointed out, we have managed to overcome some of these natural processes or these detriments of disease by um, either improved hygiene and sanitation, public health measures, by vaccines or by antibiotics. So yes, we live in a world where we can definitely live in larger congregations and withstand disease much better than probably any other time in past history. That, like you again correctly pointed out, doesn't make us immune to disease. And I think the new pathogens like SARS-CoV-2 causing COVID-19, them coming up, is something, it's not a recent phenomenon, it's more, it gets a lot of traction now, and it affects us more now because it spreads so fast, and it can just become a pandemic. Anything that would have earlier been a localized jump of infection or that pathogen from one species to another would have been a very localized event, but now it spreads very easily. So I think it's that connectivity that we really need to keep in mind when we're talking about, or when we're thinking of humans and new emerging pathogens and their ability to cause pandemics. So we have now had SARS, we have had MERS, we did have the Spanish flu, which sort of became ingrained and became like a seasonal flu, and now we have COVID-19. And yes, we are likely to see more pathogens come up. And this is a huge field of study, in fact, applying the principles of community ecology to understand when and where diseases might emerge from non-human hosts. And is it related to change in forest cover? Is it related to change in the host diversity, host composition, some animals becoming more abundant? These are fields of study that are getting a lot of attention now, precisely to understand the kind of questions you've raised. Are we more likely, is the frequency of newer diseases likely to increase? Where are the sites where it's likely to be the highest? When is it likely to spread the most? And what should we be doing to prevent these kind of outbreaks from taking place? So crowding is not the only thing, but yes, the sheer number of humans and the way we have changed the planet in the many ways we access nature does have a role to play in what diseases come up and affect us.
Thanks for the question, Srinidhi. And we'll go back to some of our plant and tree related questions now.
Okay.
So this is from a student of forestry, Karthik.
Mm-hmm.
And he wants to know if you encountered any allelopathic effects of a certain species on other or even the same species.
Okay.
And does this have an effect in seedling survival or growth? Anything like that you've encountered?
So not in the forest where I worked, but I do know of species that have allelopathic effects. In fact, a student of mine who worked in Madagascar, he did his master's project there. He was telling me this fascinating story of how tamarind, has this strongly allelopathic effect on many other species, and even on its own species, it would seem. And tamarind, they're very common as adults, but they barely have any seedlings, and anything that grows underneath the tamarind seems to get killed. But no, I have not seen this among my species, and unfortunately, I am not aware of this being there among the species that I studied. But it is certainly a phenomenon that is important in some forests.
Thanks for clearing that up. And I think this was about your own work. So coming back to something about plants. So this is a question about whether deforestation has an effect on the genetics of plants and trees. Is there anything you can share about that?
Yes, there is a lot of attention now being paid to whether the lack of connectivity or the compromised dispersal of trees from one fragment to another, whether that can reduce genetic, what does that do to genetic variability? So these studies about genetic variability happen at many levels. There's one study from the Western Ghats, which was done by Sasha Ismail. He took this one tree and he tried to see how closely related were the individuals of the seedlings to older trees that were in the same fragment versus other fragments. And they found that there was, and he found that there was some clustering that is happening. That is, it looks like the seedlings are not able to disperse very far. And so the genetic diversity of individual fragments or genomic diversity of individual fragments was decreasing. And what that means for the future of the species, we don't know, but we are kind of looking at some of these questions. There is also this interesting question about, again, coming back to this question of plant pathogen interactions. Many of these interactions, in order to face pathogens, plants have developed defenses, and these defenses are regulated by defense genes or resistance genes. And plants have different kinds of resistance genes. So a question is, if there is a change in the kind of the pathogen loads, for example, or the kind of pathogens, is that going to change the variety of resistance genes? Is that going to change the diversity of plants that are able to face this or reshape the kind of diversity of resistance genes that we see in nature?
Okay. So we have a bunch of
questions. Also, I should add that I'm not an expert in this, so I can't answer. This is a very, very specialized question, and I can't answer it very as an expert would. But the understanding the population genetics, what we call, is really a huge area of focus in fragmentation and connectivity studies.
So coming to questions about, forests. So what do you see when you see, how do seed dispersers adapt themselves in terms of dispersing seeds from a continuous forest patch to a changing fragmented forest patch? So, are they able to do it, or is it not happening as much?
Great question. So there's a lot of change that happens. Again, I don't directly study this, but there's a huge amount of literature on this. And I think there are even members of the audience who can probably answer this question better than I can. Well, the biggest change that sort of happens is that many fragments, as the fragments get smaller, they tend to lose large body dispersers. And this means that many of the tree species that are large seeded, they are not able to disperse as well because they're not getting eaten by the larger body dispersers. This is something that is being looked into in more and more detail. What are the consequences of some tree species losing their dispersers and others maybe getting dispersed better or continuing to get dispersed? And this does have consequences for the fragment, in that if a species is not able to disperse well, then it gets very restricted in space. And if that is the case, there are a couple of outcomes possible. If that tree species is one of those, like in my presentation, I said there are some tree species that are better able to handle being in crowded environments next to their own species. So if this species is like, has that feature, it will, yes, suffer a range contraction, but it may not die out completely. It will just change in terms of how far it's found and where it is found. But if there's a species that's actually quite sensitive to its enemies, and being clumped without being dispersed, if it gets clumped closer to members of its own, individuals of its own species, and this tree species will experience a lot of predation, a lot of infection, and this might reduce its population over time to an extent where it actually goes extinct. Dispersal also helps, like I mentioned in the previous example, dispersal also helps maintain genetic connectivity. So the loss of some dispersers means that some trees may see a shrink or change in their genetic diversity. Yeah, there are all of these consequences that might come about from loss of dispersers and change in dispersers. And final thing is there are some evolutionary changes that are seen. Like, this is not from dispersal, from fragmented forests, but in hunted forests, people have seen where large body dispersers have been hunted out. It looks like through time, the seeds that are produced by these different species actually become smaller. And that's because that the large seeds are not getting dispersed anymore. The larger seeded individuals are not successful anymore. And it's only the smaller seeds that end up being successful and reproducing and becoming trees. So there are all of these evolutionary changes that might happen because of the way dispersal is changing in these systems.
Okay. So coming to another question, so a lot of people have asked really specific questions, which I'm going to skip over, um, because they're about like a particular fungi in Mumbai and stuff like that. So
Ouch, I probably won't be able to answer that anyway.
yeah, no. I mean, as much as we appreciate a lot of these questions, we try to keep it more general. So someone wants to know about whether you can correlate microbial diversity with tree species diversity present in an area.
So correlate in the sense, my first answer would be yes, at least in wet forests or rainforests, that where there is higher diversity of insects and fungi, you also tend to see higher diversity of trees. Now, we don't know which is the causal direction. This is something that has happened over millions of years of evolution, co-evolution, evolutionary arms race, that these plant-enemy interactions have sort of shaped. And this is, again, a really fascinating field of study and something that I also hope to look at in the future. Is it individual fungi or insects, that make a difference, or is it an entire group or diversity of fungi? But yes, in some systems, you can see a correlation that where there's a decrease in fungal diversity, you can see a decrease in, say, plant diversity, and yes, there's a correlation. We don't know the causal link.
Okay. So coming to a completely different kind of question about diversity. So, for instance, you mentioned that some plants do better next to their own species, right? So, in monocultures like a pine forest or something like that, how does that work? Is there something you can share about that?
Yeah, good question. So this is definitely not a universal rule. This is something that we tend to see more in wet tropical forests. But the same phenomenon of fungi or insects culling back, those members of one plant species has been seen even in grassland. So it's quite universal. It is seen in temperate forests as well. But I think the forces that shape life in, or the lives of trees in a temperate forest or a pine forest are different somewhat from the forces that shape it in a grassland or a tropical wet forest. So the main stress or the main force that shapes tree communities in a temperate forest would be their ability to tolerate cold or frost. That's the first thing. And even after that, studies of that have analyzed the spatial dynamics, for example, like you sort of, they do a lot of fancy statistics on where a species is found, how close it is to another member of the same species, the individuals. And they find that these spacing dynamics happen even in temperate forests. And these dynamics do happen because of sensitivity, or to some extent are mediated by pathogens like fungi or insects. But in these really cold areas, like, a pine forest or a boreal forest, that's just, like you said, one or two species, it's really, I don't think these enemies can even survive there. I don't know it very well, but the influence of enemies becomes much, much lesser in these cold climates. There are many fewer enemies, and these interactions become much weaker, and therefore, the species that just does well in the cold is the species that sort of survives there and is able to use up the resources and become these monodominant or monoculture kind of forests. But I'll just digress a bit. There is an interesting phenomenon in tropical forests as well, where you see these monodominant stands, and that happens, or it's surmised to happen, because these species form positive fungal associations which sort of counter the effects of negative fungi. And there was a very cool study recently published in the journal Science, which showed that trees that form ectomycorrhizal association, this is from a temperate forest, are actually more resistant to fungal pathogens than trees that have arbuscular mycorrhizal or no positive mycorrhizal association. So that's why I said there are all of these complex relationships, this give and take that is going on. And it is possible that in some temperate forests, because of the prevalence or the coevolution of ectomycorrhizal fungi along with these tree species, they have become, or they have developed a stronger ability to face their pathogens, or be less susceptible or more resistant to pathogens than they would have been without these ectomycorrhizal. Pavitra, I can't hear you again.
Oh, okay, sorry.
Better. Yes, I can hear you now.
Okay. Yeah, so I was just saying, okay, that's a really interesting explanation of this whole process. And what someone is asking about is, stressors to some extent may lead to adaptation in a new environment, leading to essential changes to survive and subsequently an increase in diversity. So, could this be true for both the plants and pathogens? So, does that mean that areas near the edges, which you spoke about, may they have more diversity for both the plants and their pathogens?
That is actually a great question. And that is something that we need to understand much better. There is an argument especially in forest ecology literature, which says that if you have, um, well, not just forest ecology, but in general in fragmentation, that if you have these fragmented patches where you have a lot of variation in the habitat, and then you have edge and interior and a mix of these habitat types, then you're going to get more diversity over an area of space. That is something that needs to be understood, which a lot of studies so far seem to show that the diversity tends to decrease at edges. Um, but I think we have not still looked into these eco-evolutionary feedbacks between plants and their pathogens and how they are playing out near the forest edges. The studies have so far have been quite simple in terms of, okay, have trees increased, have fungi increased, or has diversity increased, that sort of thing. How they play out in terms of what they're doing to one another is really a sort of frontier or a growing field right now. And it'll be a couple of years or a few more years before we have the answers to some of these questions. In theory, it is possible, yes. In fact, I'm quite sure that given the rapid or much more rapid life cycles, faster life cycles of fungi compared to host trees, it's quite possible that there are evolutionary forces or processes that are acting on these fungi and changing what fungi are found where. But whether that is necessarily going to lead to an increase in their diversity, we don't know. It's very hard for us to say. It may change things. It may not really lead to a more diverse system. We just have to uh, understand that better, I think. These are very complex. It's very hard to study fungi. Most of them are not even described or known, and you need molecular tools, and often you don't even know what is the actual diversity of these species.
Okay. And I think this pertains to, predicting any sort of future species evolution, because we had a question really early on about that, can
Okay.
we predict future species evolution? I think it's beyond
Yeah.
abilities right
Yeah.
Okay. Coming back to a question about the host specificity that you mentioned. So is there so how can a single tree show associations with more than one species of fungi?
Yeah, great question. This again brings us to the sheer complexity of these relationships. So when I say host specificity, it's not really a one-on-one mapping. It's like this one species can harbor or be infected or have an association with many different kinds of fungi. Let's start with the negative associations first, the pathogens. So yes, this one species can potentially harbor or be colonized by many different kinds of, say 5 different kinds of fungi. But of these 5, it is actually only 1 or 2 which will cause the most damage, enough to kill this individual and result in a change in its population dynamics, what we say. Like if it is killing, if this, out of the 5 fungi, if fungus 1 is the one that manages to kill most seedlings, then that is most host specific on this particular tree species. Let's move to another tree species, B. That might have the same 5 fungi, but it's actually now fungus 5 that is doing most of the killing. So fungus 5 will be the most abundant fungus, the most prominent fungus killing the individuals of this species, even though the others might still sit on it and colonize it or whatever. So by host specificity, what we actually mean is, the technical term for this is apparent specificity or apparent host specificity. That is, given that you're attacked by 5 different enemies, any one of them will probably have the most impact. And that there's a decreasing or a sort of difference among these enemies, how much they impact you. Yes, so in effect, when we really study these systems in the wild, we are not really expecting like a species A has fungus 1 and species B has fungus 5. What we are expecting to see is a difference in the proportions of species on these of fungal species on these different hosts. So fungus 1 will be really abundant on species A, and the others will be less so, maybe in some predictable way. Fungus 5 is the most abundant when we sort of sequence the fungi on this species, for example, this host species.